At the time Paul is writing to the Corinthians, churches are very small. They are meeting in people's homes. Usually one of the wealthier members would have housed the worship time for the church. They would have gathered around the table for a meal. They would have read from the Old Testament. They would have prayed together. They would have sung together. And they would have celebrated what we think of as the sacrament of communion. The church is very much in its infancy at this time. Much of the New Testament hasn't been written. At the time Paul is writing to the Corinthians, none of the 4 Gospels that we're familiar with would have been written yet, even though those events would have already taken place. And from there, the church grew. It moved out of homes, and it became a separate, established institution. And as the church grew larger and larger, it took some of the elements of the early church and incorporated them into this new life. For us, this means small groups, Sunday school groups, work groups that also have a sharing and a fellowship opportunity, prayer groups, Bible study groups, the choir. These are all smaller groups within a church where people feel very close to one another, where they confide and share with one another. When the church of our denomination's Founders Day was foundering, he got together with groups and formed them in homes to meet and to pray and to reflect on Scripture. It was what's known as these class meetings that led to the development of the Methodist denomination. So as the church gets larger, smaller groups become important within the larger church. During an earlier appointment of mine, I worked with Dr. John Savage, who was an expert in church communication and conflict within churches. He wrote a wonderful little book that I would recommend to you called Caring and Listening Skills. And he talked about this particular church I served as undergoing a silo effect. A silo, as you know, is an independent building where grain might be kept, where it can be stored, where outside influences don't get in, like varmints or any kind of other infection or things like that. And within this particular church, he said this church has a number of silos. It has individual groups within the church that function as kind of autonomous units. Now, small groups within a church are a part of a healthy, larger church, provided the silo walls are porous, provided you have people in those small groups who are involved in other groups, so that everyone knows what is going on. So there's a free sharing of information that's going on and interaction between the different groups. But when the walls are not porous, when one particular group becomes focused on what it is doing to the extent of all else, that is very harmful and very divisive. It's also very old. It doesn't just affect the church in our day. It goes all the way back to Corinth. Something I take somewhat of a bit of comfort with, to think that when the church was this small, it was still dealing with some of the same challenges that we are dealing with now. And Paul doesn't approach these divisions from the perspective of orthodoxy and heresy. He doesn't pick one particular group and say, now this is what they are doing right, and here's what everyone else is doing wrong. But he is concerned that all of these groups are dividing up the nature of the Christian church at that time, that they're dividing up the Corinthians. And instead, he focuses on being unified through the cross of Christ, being unified through Jesus' death and sacrifice upon a cross. This is not a way of saying, put your differences aside and unite under a common label. It's also not a way of saying, don't worry about conflict or differences of opinion, and simply come together as one body. Paul has strong feelings about that. But it does become somewhat of a litmus test for how we approach division within the church. Ask ourselves, is this why Jesus died? Is this why Jesus gave up his heavenly throne and suffered the death and humiliation upon a cross? It doesn't take much to get church people in a tizzy over something. And I find that I keep coming back to this principle in my life within the Christian church. Whenever there's some sort of a squabble going on, I ask myself, now is this really why Jesus was crucified? One example of that, another church I served had a great division over the proper way to trim the shrubbery outside. There was one group that believed it should be tall and regal, as if you were sort of entering a great archway coming into the church. And there are others who believed it was an eyesore that obscured the building and it should be trimmed way back. Now, did Christ really die in order to teach us how to trim shrubbery? Probably not. The other thing that it does is that when people become fixated within their own silo, when they become focused on what's going on with their small group over everyone else, it narrows their focus. And it makes their focus inward and selfish to the extent of what's going on elsewhere. They think about what others are doing wrong, and they fixate on that. The crucifixion brings us all together because we are all united in our sinfulness. The crucifixion brings the sorrow of looking deep within ourselves so that we each ask, what are my sins? What am I doing to make the world unlike the way God would have the world to be? Why did Jesus have to die for me? And we are all equally loved and forgiven by God. Through the crucifixion, we find the ultimate act of selflessness and of self-giving, of God's mercy and love for us, sparing nothing and pouring out himself in order to redeem us. This becomes the ethic that in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul is going to use throughout the rest of the book. He's going to look at different areas of dispute and the nature of what's going on there, but all of them are seen through the lens of the cross. We're not all perfect. We're not all going to eliminate conflict, and we shouldn't expect to be. But thank God we are all equally forgiven and equally loved by God. The cross of Christ illustrates that. Amen.